So good morning. Thank you so much for the invitation to speak here today. I'm really excited to be able to speak to all of you because I have a problem and I need your help. So for this kind of talk on, for this particular talk on social justice, we're going to be actually addressing an issue that exists surrounding social justice within academia that requires all of your specific skill sets. And hopefully it appears up on the big screen. There we go. So the problem that I've been noticing over the years, I'll get in a little bit of the background of why, is an issue of what I'm calling the publication name change problem. So this is a particular problem that exists for transgender academics, particularly regarding when we change our names, if we change our names after we have a couple of publications out already and want to continue on a career in academia. So who am I? Why is this issue important to me? Why do I need your help addressing that? So as was mentioned, my name's Elena. I'm here at the University of New Hampshire. I'm an experimental nuclear physicist. This is a photograph of me in my natural environment and national laboratory. And a few years ago, I was part of an effort within the American Physical Society, or the APS, which is the big national organization in the US for physicists, to look at issues of the LGBT climate within physics. I did this because I'm trans myself, and when I was a graduate student pursuing physics, I had a lot of issues that I was facing kind of coming up through. For instance, the laboratory I was doing research at didn't have protections on the basis of sexual orientation, gender identity, or gender expression. So as I was kind of going through this career in this field that I loved, I didn't know if I would actually be able to find a job within the field. And that's kind of one of many issues that kind of came up at the time. And when I started looking for resources for LGBT people within physics, circa 2008-ish, I didn't find anything. All I found was the occasional homework help form where there was a student who would post something along the lines of, hey, I'm gay in physics and I don't know of anyone else, am I the only one? And they would be met with page after page after page of people telling them, why are you bringing this up? Sexuality has nothing to do with science. If you talk about being gay in physics, you really don't have any shot of a career, so why even bother talking about it? I was young and naive and didn't know that that was the only thing out there, and I found resources for things for women in physics, for people of color within physics, so I thought surely there must be something for LGBT people. So I went out and sought out some of these groups. When I went to my first conference as a graduate student, I asked where the resources were for LGBT physicists at the Committee on the Status of Women in Physics, and the whole room went dead silent for about 30 seconds before somebody very quietly said, we never thought of that. So my response to that was to go back to my hotel room, spend a night crying, and then come back and build a national organization to address the issue. To be fair, from my perspective, I feel like I don't need applause for that because I would not be within physics to this day if I didn't have this community of other people within physics that I could address and talk about the issues I was facing with. Because without having any sense of community or anybody else out there, all the issues that I was facing, I felt like I was the only one facing, and that they were all issues that were my issues specifically. And when you have that mindset, it's really hard to address things. So by finding and meeting other LGBT people within physics and building this organization, it taught me that I am not alone, that these issues are big systemic issues, and that we really need to address them. So I'm putting this organization together. We've reached out to the APS, and this is kind of the background leading to this big report that I have up here. And I want to talk about a little bit of the data that we found in there before we go into the more interactive portion of this presentation. So I'm not going to go through all the background and findings. If you want the whole report, it's on the APS website listed here, or if you Google LGBT physicist, you'll find my organization's website, LGBT plus physicists, and it's also posted there as well, along with a number of other resources. But some of the findings that we found that I will kind of briefly touch on at the moment is that the climate experienced by LGBT physicists was highly variable, depending on who was responding to it. And when we were doing this report, this was the first report of its kind. And one of the things that I'm particularly excited about with this report is that, as far as I know, this was the first ever study that got enough transgender scientists within any scientific field to be able to do a statistical analysis on the transgender population. So I'm really excited that we actually have some of that data to show as well. I'll talk about that in a minute. What we're looking at here is a level of people who felt uncomfortable in their workplace, departments, and workplaces within physics. And we broke it down for LGBT men, LGBT women, and gender nonconforming people within the field. And both for levels of comfort and also people who observed harassment, we kind of saw this trend that overall LGBT people were seeing harassment happening, they were experiencing it, they didn't feel comfortable, but that rate really changed depending kind of on which different population we were in. So Sophia was talking a little bit earlier about issues of intersectionality, and that's something that really came out and stood out to us within our data, and you'll see that kind of as a repeated theme. When we look at direct experiences of harassment, and we break it down by gender, what we found is that significant fractions of LGBT physicists directly experienced or observed exclusionary behavior. And we'd also found that observation of exclusionary behavior within departments was as high, if not higher, an indication that LGBT people were likely to leave their institution as experiencing it directly. So that was an interesting thing that we had found out, that even if you're not the direct recipient of discrimination, if you see other people being discriminated against, that highly affected whether or not you wanted to stay in your current department. For LGBT men, about 11% of them experienced harassment. When it jumped to LGBT women, that number tripled, up to about 30%. And for people who identified as gender nonconforming, that number jumped all the way up to 40%. And when people identified as transgender, which we split apart this, just kind of how we took our data, because our trans respondents fit into these three categories. We just separated trans respondents from cis respondents here. And trans respondents, every other one of us has at some point experienced this kind of discrimination or exclusionary behavior. I also want to point out here the importance of having trans and non-binary people within academia and in order to do these studies. So how this data was able to be broken apart in this manner and was able to give us good results was really dependent on the fact that we had a group of people that included multiple trans people as part of the committee that built together this report. So how does this interact? Personal example, 2 days ago I received a questionnaire in the mail from Gallup. And they're kind of asking just kind of a whole bunch of questions, getting a whole bunch of seemingly random information about ladders and state of economy and weird things. And at the end of it, they asked a series of questions on sex and gender. And it asked, are you male, female, transgender? And anytime I see a question like that, I have to stare at it because it's like, well, do I have to be trans here? Do I have to be a woman here? Can I be a trans woman here? It's just this kind of taking of statistics gives us bad statistics on trans people. And I think part of the reason why we were able to get a statistically significant number of trans people to actually do this analysis on was because we asked gender-related questions in a way that was inclusive and actually got good data on people's identities and made them comfortable in answering the questions related to that. If we didn't do that, we would have muddled up if we'd asked this in the same way, one, we couldn't necessarily separate the trans people out from general LGBT men and women because that would all kind of be mixed up. The numbers of people who would identify as trans, because you have to choose one or the other, would then be lower, so your population of numbers kind of goes down from what the actual population is. It just leads to bad statistics, bad data, and bad data leads to bad implementations of policies and addressing different issues. And related to that point as well, I'm standing before you as far as I know, the only transgender tenure track faculty member here at UNH. And we have about 750 faculty members here. If I do the rough math, that about 0.5 to 0.6 of the general population is trans, really there should be about 5 or 6 of us. So there's definitely an issue where we're not seeing as many trans people here at UNH that we would expect kind of based on general population. And part of that's going to be what I want to have your help with addressing today. We also noticed that LGBT physicists with additional marginalized identities face greater levels of discrimination. So we had direct data on this from different categories of gender that I just showed you. Even though we were able to get the population we were able to get enough trans respondents to do statistics on, we were not able to get enough respondents who were LGBT people of color who were also physicists in order to do a statistically significant analysis on, which in and of itself is a data point. That being said, we did make sure that we didn't want to have their voices overlooked because we couldn't do a statistical analysis on. So in this study, we have a section on qualitative analysis that we did, where we did a series of interviews with people, follow-up interviews with people of marginalized identities. And some of the things that stood out is, one, that people with these multiple marginalized identities are experiencing greater levels of harassment and discrimination than people who fit into just a lower number of them. Not only that, but when you fall under these multiple identities and something happens, it's not always immediately clear if that thing is happening because you're a trans person, or because you're a woman, or because you're a trans woman, or because you're a black person, or all these different things can kind of come into it, and you can't really easily break it apart with, well, was that a racist thing that happened? Was that a sexist thing that happened? Was that a homophobic thing that happened? It's kind of hard to really tweeze these things out, particularly at an individual level, which is another reason why it's important to do these studies and get better statistics, so that way we can actually implement changes to how we do academia in order to make things better for people who are most marginalized within our academic communities. And I mentioned this earlier, but it's really worth reiterating that for our trans population, again, this is the first study of this we could do in a scientific field, is that for observing harassment and experiencing harassments where we had statistically significant numbers, trans people by far experienced the highest levels of both from what we had seen. With, like I said, half of us experiencing it and 60% of us having seen it in others. So we have direct data indicating that discrimination and harassment happens to trans physicists. How can we address this? In the report, which I mentioned was to the APS, they had asked us to give them recommendations on how we can address a lot of these findings that we had found. So we have 6 different initiatives up here that we brought up with the APS. Some of them are being worked on at higher levels than others. Some of them are really, really difficult. And it's one of these really difficult ones that I'm here talking about with all of you, which is the second one. This a need to address address the need to systematically accommodate name changes in publication records, particularly for transgender academics. And really what this means is we need to improve how journal and publication records are done so that trans scientists, when we change our names, if we've already published some things, allows us to update our names on past publications so that we are not outed as trans, which being outed as trans, as we just kind of saw, looks like it's going to indicate different levels of discrimination and harassment that we face. Or if we get rid of things under an old name, then we would look less qualified than we are, risking discrimination on that front. And that would happen for your CV, your publication record, anytime you apply for a grant, anytime you apply for a job, anytime you apply for a promotion. Every year I have to do an annual review. I have to include this. Do I have to out myself as trans on all of these and face discrimination at every single one of these levels? And right now, for many trans physicists, many trans academics, that answer is yes, because we have not developed a good strategy on how to address this issue. In the report itself, I'm going to kind of read this paragraph to kind of put you in the mood for this. We specifically said that APS should work to improve electronic journal records and publication procedures so that transgender physicists who change their names will have their full publication records visible and at the same time not be outed by their publication records. That is the challenge that stands before us. This issue is also of significance to those who experience a name change due to changing marital status or other reasons. This doesn't just affect trans physicists. It affects us in particular ways, but we're not the only ones affected by this problem. Kind of a visual implication of this, let's say you have a publication record, you start under one name, you change your name, do you just lose those publications? How do you maintain a career in academia without outing yourself and without updating, without making it seem like you're less qualified or without outing yourself on your CV? This is really the challenge that stands before us. So whenever I've brought this up in different audiences, there are usually three big things that people kind of immediately come to of how this issue can be addressed. And none of those options are good. So I'm going to tell you what they all are, so maybe we can come up with some ideas that are a little bit better. So the first one is what organizations like ORCID do, which is not changing any past publications, but creating things like unique identifiers where it makes it really, really easy to connect any current name with any past name. So this could work well for a lot of different people. One group that it often works well for, although not always, are people who change their last names when they get married. So that way, when you just kind of pull up one name, it makes it really easy to find both, so that way you can go back through the publication record and find their previous publications. That doesn't work for trans people because that outs us on our CVs, our publication records, our grant proposals, annual reviews. Basically, anything that we need to do to maintain a career in academia, we risk being discriminated against because this solution forces us to be out on all of those. So this isn't a viable option for trans people who change their name after they've had some publications out. The other thing is what I mentioned before, well, why don't you just leave off publications from that had your old name on them? And the same hand, this one won't out us as being trans, so we kind of lose discrimination from that front a little bit. But it makes us seem like we're less competent than we really are because it takes away, the lifeblood of what makes academics academics is our publication record. So it directly makes us seem like we're not as competitive as we are, and particularly given the competitive nature within academia and the need to have trans people in academia so that way we can get, among the variety of different sciences and whatnot that we can do, just having better people who know intimately the issues that trans people face, studying trans populations so that way we can even ask simple questions better is of high importance. And if we don't have trans people within academia, within positions that can do things like this, we're just going to continue perpetuating bad data. And this problem of kind of removing these past publications just kind of further leads to this level of discrimination because you seem like you're less competent than you really are, even though you're not outed by your record in the same way. The last one that gets brought up is, well, why don't trans people only ever publish with their first, maybe middle initial and their last name, and then when they change their name, make sure that they choose a name that has the same initials as that. This comes up a lot as kind of the solution for a lot of people's minds. One, this requires years of foresight. And you're asking that of people within a marginalized community where family issues come up extremely, extremely drastically. I mean, I've had multiple trans people who've been kicked out of their homes living in our place because their parents kicked them out of their house, for instance. And part of that means that in order to just kind of survive as a trans person, even before you come out, one of the ways that a lot of trans people, one of the mechanisms we do to survive, especially kind of before we're out to ourselves even, is to overcompensate for the gender that we were assigned at birth. And part of that within academia means kind of publishing under, let's say you were assigned male at birth, transitioned female later in life. Before you transition, you really got to show, ooh, you're a guy, right? Because that helps protect you in some ways from a lot of issues of violence and discrimination against you from being trans, because it's kind of a level of hiding that a lot of us do. And a lot of us do it unconsciously because it's just a reaction mechanism, we have from being beat up in high school to try and overcompensate for that. So you're not only asking for these years of foresight, but you're asking for it within the same period of time that we're trying to deal with these things by overcompensating. It's just, you're asking a lot of trans people if this is your solution. And that really makes it extremely unfair to ask trans people to do this. Not only that, but name changes themselves are extremely, extremely personal of how names are chosen and why for a variety of different reasons. And if you're asking somebody to choose the name that they will have for the rest of their life because it will give them a shot, maybe, at a career that's highly competitive, is also a really huge ask of anybody. So this is not a viable option. So that leads us to kind of the challenge of where we are today, and somewhere where I don't have a good answer for, which is how do we address this problem? Because we live in a world where our publication records are what makes or breaks our careers. Our publication records are often printed on paper form stored in our libraries, but we are also in an age now where electronic journals are becoming a lot more popular. I've had students who, when our library was closed, or an online journal wasn't accessible for a day because of maintenance, instead of walking down the stairs to our library, they just waited until the online one came back on to do a publication search. As we have more and more students kind of coming in who've lived natively within the digital world, and we're moving kind of academic journals more and more towards digital media, and we're kind of connecting this with all of our digital databases and reconnecting it, this gives us an opportunity because within the digital world, these kinds of changes can be made. And what I want to ask all of you, because I'm sure that you all know this way, way better than me, because I'm an experimental nuclear physicist, and if anything is more complicated than one proton and one neutron, I don't know what's going on. So I need all of your help. So what we're going to do now is take a couple minutes, group off into groups of maybe 5 or 6 people, your kind of closest neighbors, and I would like to know from you that for solutions that would address this, what kind of issues do you foresee based on how academia and publications are structured that would cause this kind of change, this kind of goal of creating this new system where trans people aren't outed by our publication records by allowing us to change names on past publications? What are the issues with that from your perspective? All right, I'm going to grab everybody's attention back up here for a minute. So first of all, I want to say thank you all for engaging with this question with the level of enthusiasm and excitement that I'm hearing you all just at the volume and the level you're talking with each other about. That makes me really excited. So what I want to do now is take some of the issues that all of you have found and maybe have some help passing some microphones around of if you wouldn't mind raising your hands of what issues came up within your group discussions, and I'll jot them up here. And then our next question, kind of keep in mind as I'm writing these down, is going to be how can we start addressing, what can be done to start addressing some of the issues that we're going to be facing.
One of the first things that came up for our group was that even if you are easily able to change the record from the original publication, the effect has already rippled out in every citation. So we were talking about the sort of trouble of sort of chasing down all of the instances of the earlier name and the problems that that would cause.
Definitely, thank you.
We talked about if the change happens. So you've informed everyone to change the name on your previous publications, but you are not the corresponding author. Should someone get in touch with the corresponding author and want, I don't know, to be put in touch with the other authors so they can find out more about your methods, say, your corresponding author probably didn't get that memo, and now you've been outed to your previous PI, or what have you, or collaborators. And another issue we thought of was fraudulent academics who are gonna look at the system and go, you say I can put my name on the work of people with other names? And what kinds of security controls would you want to implement for that?
Hey, thank you. Yeah.
We came up with the thought that indexing databases will have the old name, so that's a place where it would need to be changed beyond the publisher being asked to change it.
So I'm kind of writing some things down. If anybody else raises your hand, I have some help putting microphones around.
So one thing we talked about is that it's often incumbent on the trans person to initiate a request for this change or accommodation, and so a good system ideally would give each scholar ownership of their own record or their own data, so that they don't have to be contacting old publishers or things of that nature, that everybody has the option to own how they're represented.
So we talked about the issue of getting buy-in from all the different publishers. Like someone mentioned, these articles are housed in many different places. You know, presumably you've published in many different journals with many different publishers. So you might be, if someone is searching in, say, Science Direct, you know, would Elsevier be willing to change your name? Would Wiley, would Springer, all these different publishers that you would have to work with, to coordinate with, and just sort of the magnitude of that issue of bringing all these different companies together to work on this. And then we also talked about just print publications. How do you address that? You can make an electronic change, but if something was in print and you issue a correction, that sort of outs it in and of itself.
Yes.
Someone, I'd like to give credit, but I forget who said it, at simultaneously changing the culture, so it's not an issue. So what if you changed your name?
I hope I'm alive to see that, but I am doubtful. Yeah, maybe take one or two more. Or does this kind of summarize what all the big issues you talked about were?
We also thought about people's personal citation manager collections that would, you know, be sitting on people's personal computers.
All right, thank you. So we've got, you know, as you've kind of all been discussing this, you're starting to realize the enormity of the problem. We have one more back there. Okay.
No, you don't have to write anything else, because this is kind of a comment that goes along with changing culture. One of the things that we talked about at this table too was the sort of a more enforced use of ORCID as the way that you say you authored something, because that would just entirely remove the need to have a name affiliated with it at that level. That obviously is also not something we may see in our lifetime, but I think that's sort of the level of change that would allow discrimination to not be available in any way, because it would just equalize everything.
Yeah, and when I actually first started looking into this issue, I mean, I was young at the time. I was a graduate student kind of coming out when ORCID started really developing and becoming, what it is today. I actually brought this issue up with them back when they were still forming it in the hopes that it could be addressed early enough to hopefully see that as kind of being an in for it, but it wasn't picked up within the organization at the time, so that ORCID's current solution is the first one of the potential things that doesn't work really well, which is what they do is make it really easy to find both old names and current names and bring them together. So I think ORCID is definitely a step in the right direction because it allows us to have a unique identifier that's not a name, that is something that might be able to be changed, but it also requires ORCID itself to change how they handle name changes as well. So I think it's on the right track and something that's really important, but there's an issue with that as well. So all these issues up here, they're going to disappear for a moment, but I'm going to bring them back. The reason they're going to disappear for a moment is because we're going to go to our next question of, with all these big issues and this kind of big scope of this problem, which is a big problem, how can some of these issues that we found be addressed? So what are some of the kind of discrete, what things can be done at, institutional levels or personal levels or within community levels, publications, publication companies, things like that? What needs to be changed in order to address each of the issues that I'll go back to now? So I'll have another 10 minutes or so to discuss that. All right, I'm going to start grabbing everybody's attention again, get us kind of back focused up on the front. I also know that not everybody is necessarily comfortable speaking in front of a crowd, so especially for this part where we're starting to talk about how do we address these things, if you have ideas that other people aren't saying, but you're not comfortable kind of raising your hand in front of a group, this is my email address, and I would love to know your thoughts on this, because as far as I know, this is the first time a group of, 50, 60 different people in the library sciences kind of all got together to workshop and brainstorm on this idea. So I'm really excited about this. So I would love to hear what are some things that you came up with of what can be done to address some of these big issues that go with addressing this problem.
Okay, I can start. I see a couple of hands in back first.
So most of our discussion was centered around how do we make publishers care, because I think we in the library world know that publishers really only care about money, and so tying it into some kind of either a penalty or, on the flip side, a reward system if publishers are willing to work on this. So a couple of the things that we talked about were we in libraries, especially the larger libraries that have a lot of purchasing power, we have power to negotiate with publishers when it comes to things that we want to see them doing. So, we did a lot of this. I think libraries have done a lot of this over the past 5 or 10 years with things like ADA compliance and making materials by publishers accessible to screen readers and things like that. And so I think this could be something that we, especially the larger purchasing power libraries, take up, saying, we really want to see you guys working on this and making an easy avenue for people to change their names. And then we also talked about potentially, and this where our, or at least my anyway, I don't know about others at my table, but our legal knowledge about this is perhaps not what it could be, but if making this a discrimination issue, and then potentially being able to bring legal action if publishers are not willing to work on this.
We got sidetracked by the logistics of it. how would this even work when we've talked about all of the concerns of your name already being out there, and how do you go and track down every single instance of it? And we were thinking about ORCID tweaked just a little bit so that rather than linking back to your profile with your legal name, it's your ID. That is what you publish under. If you choose, you could have a profile page with your legal name or with an avatar name like Twitter, and that is your choice, but you are strongly encouraged to stick with your ID. And journals only accept your ID. And your profile page, like ORCID is under your control. So down the line, you change your name, you change it on your profile page. That's the only place someone can link your researcher ID back to your representation of yourself. And once you update it, that's who you are. And it would have to, be some change in society. I mean, probably some of us have tried to have the ORCID talk with your institution, trying to get ORCID for institutions issuing an ID to all your new grad students. It doesn't always go well. So having it be just the standard would require some culture change.
Mm-hmm.
Great, thank you.
This sort of ties into the publishers part, but within our institutions, I think there is a level of awareness that others have to sort of be educated about these topics. And I'll use boot camp as an example. So when people registered, some of you may have seen options to choose male, female, gender nonconforming, or whatever other options. Those choices weren't there before, and UNH had not experienced this for other events that were held at this institution. And so opening up that conversation really kind of opened the doors initially to make it possible for other events to have those options as well. So, I mean, not just with conference and catering and events, but even in our departments in the library, having these conversations is just one step forward.
Something we talked about at our table was that getting started needs to happen. And so there are going to be a lot of problems, but that shouldn't prevent getting started. And I feel like then also people will jump on the bandwagon. So if it starts with one database or if it starts with one publisher, start there.
We also talked about how, and I think you kind of just touched on this, Eugenia, you get your early adopters and your champions, like if you can get American Physical Society on board with this, and we can all have that conversation with ORCID about how this is really a personal privacy and personal control thing, rather than, oh, we want to save the history of your old names, compare from what Wikipedia does. And specifically how often Wikipedia cites the old names of transgender people that they're writing about without their permission. But you get your early adapters, and then you start figuring out what the pressure points are. Like, I was over here going, whoa, in the group who was talking about legal and like what's the stick? Because we were all sitting here thinking CARES. They did great work on the sticks. I think it does take both.
Yeah, got time for one or two more. Yeah.
So we wandered around a lot of stuff, so I'll try to kind of sum up because I think we hit on some interesting points. One of the things brought up at this table was what's happening outside of publishing, just making a name change. It was brought up that in some places that has to go into a newspaper. It's published, you changed your name. So there's other places that forced outing is happening. And we talked about, well, who could lobby for this? Where would the money come from to lobby for something? How do you generate interest and money to be able to engage those folks? We did talk about having individual trying to get a publisher on board. Or, I was saying, like, University of California made a really big statement with their database stuff. Could you find a really large institution to make kind of a big statement and get the ball rolling? And I also think it would do well by things to just extract this a little bit out of transgender and just make it a conversation. I was saying, if I'm a woman trying to escape my abusive husband and I change my name, like, I don't want that all over the place. So I think it is a much bigger question. And I think to frame it in a much bigger way might get financial support to pursue changes.
Thank you. I have time for about one more. Or not, that's okay. For our last one, we're running a slightly shorter on time for this last question that I have for you than we have on the previous ones. But again, I'll leave all these up in a moment after I change it. But the last big question that I have for all of you is, in your positions of where you are right now, what is something that you can do that would help to address this issue? And the many different aspects of kind of the big parts of what addressing this issue would look like. All right, I'm gonna grab you all back one last time because we've only got a few minutes left, but please don't let this be the end of these conversations. And I'll be joining you all for lunch, so if anybody wants to talk afterwards, we can chat more about the different things there as well. So, as we kind of finish up here, I would love to hear from you. In all of your positions, what are some things that you can do right now to help with this issue?
Something that anyone can do regardless of their position is just start having these conversations with their colleagues and just pushing the issue and bringing it up more often.
I'm going to jump on that. Have these conversations with your vendors, with your publishers. We all go to conferences. This one is unique in that we don't bring in vendors, but we sometimes in other conferences we have vendors do talks to us, but we should talk to them.
Yes, but we also need to know what to say. So we can present the problem, but without a strategy, where does it go?
How are you handling name changes?
Yeah.
And I will say, asking the question, even if you know that right now the answers you're going to get are going to be those 3 answers that I gave you, because that's the answer I've always gotten every time I've asked this. By asking the question, you get a thought rolling. And part of how LGBT physicists came into existence, which is what snowballed leading to the change in APS in the study, started because I would ask questions that I knew the answers to sucked, but I needed to ask the questions because the issues weren't being addressed. And that was a really good first way of doing it, of just being like, how are you addressing this issue? And when somebody's answer to that is, we're not, that's a really good way to get in the door. What else?
I feel like one starting point is also like baseline cultural competency in a way. Some people don't know that there are LGBT scientists, or that I think people will often have these conversations not thinking that there are trans people in the room with you and you might not know. And so I think building an understanding of how to be like a thoughtful, respectful human being would help people feel like empowered to address these questions if they feel like they have a baseline understanding of this community's needs.
Perfect. Thank you. What else?
A couple more things we discussed was building on having these conversations, have them with your colleagues at your institution, with the diversity, equity, and inclusion groups on your campus, student and otherwise. Have them with your professional organizations. Does ALA have a strategy about this? Does ACRL? Maybe we want to propose that they start on that and get organized that way and bring that pressure that libraries have on publishers to bear that way too. Another piece was our institutions have profiles of researchers, faculty pages and other things that are pulling data from public sources like Google, from Scopus, from all of these places that have the wrong name. Talk to your campus IT, talk to your administration about what can we do to make the local copy a little more under individual control. Because I've seen some of those requests play out poorly. And I think we should be doing better on that front at least.
With that, I think we are out of time, maybe. So one thing that was just said, and I just really want to reiterate this, is this connect and organize, I think is probably the single most important thing that all of you can do, because this is intimately related to all of what you do on a level far more than on what I do. I mean, I'm on the part of it where I'm affected by it. I don't know the ins and outs of kind of the academic publishing world except as an author. And this connection and organizing, what this is going to do is create those ripple effects. And I really like that we're kind of ending on this point, because if I go back a couple slides to the very first issue that we had was the fact that there are ripple effects that come from it. And because of all these different ripple effects, that creates this problem being really big. But by going in and creating new ripples, I really think this is the way forward to address this issue. So I really, from the bottom of my heart, want to say thank you for engaging with this issue, giving me a lot to think about, and to, as I continue having these conversations, bring up with different people in my spheres. And I really hope that all of you continue having these conversations as well, because you can really make an impact in a lot of trans academic lives. Thank you.